Today we're going to look at right speech, the Buddhist ideal of right speech, and how it relates to our ideals about free speech, with some examples from the history of the fight over free speech in the United States, coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you want more of a deep dive into topics on early Buddhism, courses, including a new course I have out about the history of the Buddha's life as a historical person, check out onlinedharma.org. So what I'm going to do here today is to discuss mostly some topics around free speech, the development of free speech, some ideas about it, how certain court cases influenced it, or at least one court case. I obviously can't go into too much detail. I want to keep things relatively short here, but try to get as pithy as we can, and then relate it to some ideas about Buddhist Buddhist right speech, and how those ideals sort of dovetail with ideals of free speech, their differences and similarities, and how we can have some upshots about all of this for our speech and writing and other things online, which is of course so important nowadays. But just to start it off, in the West we have a deep ideal of free speech, of freedom of speech, freedom of inquiry into all things. This is an Enlightenment ideal, an ideal that came out of the European Enlightenment back in the 17th and 18th centuries, 19th century, even some of it. These ideals that somehow keeping things secret was a problem, and that it was best to allow inquiry and freedom of the press and freedom of discussion about all things. And the internet is often considered a sort of a bastion of free speech, a place where we can come and discuss absolutely anything and everything we want. We can express whatever opinions we want about anything without fear of censorship. At least that sort of has been the ideal about of the internet. Now, Buddhist right speech is somewhat different. Right speech is generally defined along 4 different parameters. That is, that we should avoid lying, we should avoid harsh speech, we should avoid divisive speech, and we should avoid what's called or termed idle chatter, sort of meaningless speech, just sort of blah 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 about whatever happens to be. And those 4 elements of Buddhist right speech don't include an ideal of free speech per se, so it's a slightly different ideal, it's a slightly different ethical ideal, a slightly different virtue, right speech from free speech, but there are going to be some comparisons we can make. I think we should at first say that right speech, or I should say free speech in the sort of traditional sense we find in the West and around the world, is, I think, an ideal that is definitely worth pursuing. The old expression is that sunlight is the best disinfectant. The idea being that when things are exposed to the light, when they're exposed to day, then rot and corruption can wither, because if we can see it, then we can discuss it openly, and we can fight against it, or we can pass laws against it. People who engage in it have to suffer the consequences of doing these kinds of actions. At least that's the hope, that's the ideal. Whereas, on the other hand, if freedom of the press in particular, freedom of open discussion is clamped down upon, is shut down, then these kinds of corruption, this kind of public rot or public malfeasance can fester, can even grow, because if nobody's looking at it, then of course people can do what they want to behind closed doors, and that can be a problem. On the other hand, it's also clear that freedom of the speech can be fetishized on its own, as when we see online trolling activities sort of defended by some parties as being simply part of free speech, and that trolls should be allowed to do what they want to because they have the freedom of speech to troll just as the rest of us have the freedom of speech to discuss things in a reasonable manner. And there's obviously a problem there as well, because it's hard to have any kind of a discussion at all when trolls are around. They tend to behave in ways that disrupt discussion and in ways that push people away and indeed close things down. And I mean, just by a matter of being around, they tend to force people off of platforms. speech is not entirely free anywhere. The ideal of free speech is an ideal, but as a matter of fact, speech has never been entirely free in the eye of any law anywhere, as far as I know. So, for example, you're not allowed to shout fire in a crowded theater if there's no fire. Obviously, that's going to cause a riot. It's going to cause people to potentially get injured. You're not allowed to libel somebody. You're not allowed to incite to riot. You're not allowed to conspire in various ways. These are all senses in which speech is involved, words are involved. That's all that we're doing, is speaking or writing something down. But that's enough. And the law does see that these are problems, that these can be things that you can be potentially arrested for in certain circumstances, certainly. And so we're not actually free to do all these things. More problematic here in terms of freedom of speech, and indeed also in its own way related to right speech in the Buddhist sense, are concepts in the United States around what's called hate speech and fighting words. And there's one famous case about fighting words, hate speech and fighting words, which revolves around comments made by, I believe, Justice Murphy in a case called Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire, where Justice Murphy defined fighting words. He defined it as those words which, by their very utterance, inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace. And this is a case back, I believe, in the middle of the last century, where Walter Chaplinsky, who was a Jehovah's Witness, was out in a town in New Hampshire, and he was basically haranguing the crowds. He was out in a public street declaiming about the problems of organized religion, handing out pamphlets, and basically a crowd grew around him, and they started berating him because of what he was saying. And eventually there was fighting within the crowd, between the crowd and him, and a police officer came over and took him into custody, took Walter Chaplinsky into custody. And at that point, Walter Chaplinsky said to the police officer that he was a damned racketeer and a fascist, at which point the police officer arrested him because there was a law in this town of New Hampshire that it was illegal to basically offend somebody, to say offensive words towards somebody in a public place. So the case then revolved around whether this arrest was legal, whether this law was actually constitutional. And it was upheld as constitutional by the Supreme Court. Now, there are many, many problems with this case, which I won't get into, but the question is one of offense, of taking offense, of whether it is legal or reasonable to basically prosecute somebody for saying something offensive. Now, it's pretty clear, I think, to most of us that there's going to be differences of opinion about what is offensive. For some of us, it will be offensive to do things like insult a police officer, or burn a flag, or say something that's religiously blasphemous or impious. For some of us also, it will be offensive to use certain kinds of derogatory terms about people based on their sex or their race or their religion or their sexual origin, their sexual orientation or their gender identity or their caste or their ability or any one of a number of different things. And for still others of us, will be offended by all of these things. And still more will not be offended by any of them. Will say that they're never offended by anything. Some people make that claim. So it's pretty clear that offense is going to be a matter of opinion, a matter of taste, a matter of our own personal predilections. So Justice Murphy here, in talking about hate speech and fighting words, was talking about words which by their very utterance tend to cause a breach of the peace. But it's pretty clear that the question as to whether a word will cause a breach of the peace is something of a matter of personal idiosyncrasy. In certain cases, individual people will have idiosyncratic kinds of reactions towards particular words. Whereas in other cases, it's pretty clear that a word is going to have a quite general kind of effect on people and will indeed incite perhaps a breach of the peace, perhaps a riot, whatever it might be. And the problem also is that this depends on culture. It's a cultural issue. In certain parts of the world, in certain parts of the United States or of your country, certain words will have effect that they will not have in other parts. And this will also be true in certain times as well. And perhaps at certain times, certain years it'll have a problem, and later years perhaps not, or the other way around. There are going to be massive differences based on culture, which will determine whether or not one's being offended by something is only considered a personal idiosyncrasy, in which case it's not going to be under the aegis of the law, it's not going to be a legal problem, or whether your own tendency to be offended by something is going to be something quite big, something which actually might have a broader social or political kind of impact, in which case perhaps Justice Murphy's point makes sense. Now, unfortunately, I don't think that this problem is ever really ultimately soluble, because we have what amount to two quite different ethical counterweights, or ethical problems which themselves become a dilemma when put together. On the one hand, we have the clear ethical benefit to allowing free discourse and free inquiry into all things. As I say, that sort of opens us up to being able to investigate whatever problems there might be with particular beliefs or particular ideals or ideas. And so there's certainly an ideal for free speech in all things and free inquiry. But there's also an ideal for living in harmony and peace with our neighbors. And to an extent, this is going to be violated if we allow all kinds of speech into all things. This is part of when the Buddhists talk about speech not being divisive. Because divisive speech tends to create problems. It tends to create divisions. It tends to disturb the peace, which is something that, in general, the law is structured to fight against. Now, online, this problem is particularly acute. As I mentioned at the beginning, we tend to think of the internet as kind of a Wild West, if you like, a sort of an open area where free speech abounds. But this has its drawbacks. And one of the drawbacks that we've seen has been the explosion of kind of hate speech in platforms such as the one that we're on right now, which is YouTube, or platforms such as Facebook and so on. And this is one of these kinds of problems has been one reason why YouTube recently, Facebook and other places, but in particular YouTube, has been fighting against certain kinds of videos that promote hate in various ways. And I'll have a link down below to a recent blog post, I believe it was, by YouTube about some of their strategies and intentions along these lines, which has been to demonetize videos that they find have hateful content in them. They've tried to make them less available through YouTube search. They've even taken some off of the platform entirely if they clearly advocate certain kinds of hate-filled positions. Now, I mean, there's going to be questions here. The first I should get out of the way right away, which is that YouTube is not a public platform in the sense that it's not owned by the government. So YouTube can take down whatever videos they want. It's not literal censorship. Censorship is really an issue of what the government can do, not what a private company can do. So that's one issue. Another issue is that, of course, YouTube is never going to be perfect about this. There's going to be probably hundreds or thousands of people involved in vetting these videos. They're going to make all kinds of mistakes. They're going to go too far in certain circumstances. They're not going to go far enough in many circumstances. So this is always going to be a work in progress, unfortunately, because deciding, as we've just mentioned, deciding what counts as offensive in certain respects and what doesn't is going to come down to gray areas of personal opinion, where some people will clearly be offended by something and other people will not, and there has to be somebody in between who's making the decisions. And they're never going to be able to do this to everybody's satisfaction. So the Buddhist ideal of right speech, I think, involves topics in all of the areas we've been discussing in this video. Certainly it does involve the issue of truth, the issue of open inquiry. The Buddha famously in the Kalama Sutta, the Sutta to the Kalamas, which I've done a video on, you can see if you want to see that, discusses the issue of being able to vet, to look seriously at competing theories, about competing ideals, and to decide between them. And of course, that's not going to be possible if there isn't open inquiry into these ideas. The Buddhist first part of right speech is, of course, truthful speech, or avoiding lies and avoiding untruthful speech. And that is part of open inquiry, part of free inquiry is to be truthful. But there are there's other issues, in particular, avoiding harsh speech and avoiding divisive speech. And these are, I think, part of what we run into online, what we run into in cases of hate speech, in cases of what's so-called fighting words, where you have speech that's clearly divisive to no greater purpose. And then the question is it really the sort of thing that we should be allowing and even championing in an online kind of environment? Now, the final point in Buddhist right speech is this ideal of avoiding idle chatter. Now, I think it's probably best to notice that idle chatter, the Buddha's arguing against idle chatter, makes the most sense from within, let's say, a monastic context. And indeed, the Buddha did argue pretty strenuously with monastics that they should not discuss certain kinds of topics that were sort of not important to their final goal of awakening. So issues of kings and governments and who's on top and who's not on top, and armies and all that kind of stuff, the kind of chatter about the daily world that isn't really relevant to their own awakening. The Buddha said that they should avoid that kind of talk. Now, there's all kinds of ways that we can discuss this and consider it, I think, in a reasonable way, because obviously even monastics have to have some idea about the politics and the society that they live in. Nevertheless, the point is that they shouldn't go overboard with that. To the extent that this is, I'm not sure to the extent that this is true about lay people, however. Lay people need more general information about the broader society. So, in any event, there are lots of lessons here, I think, for online communities with right speech, with the Buddhist ideal of right speech. First of all, I think the ideal of free speech, of totally unfettered free speech, has pretty well been shown to be a non-starter online. It leads to all kinds of problems. In particular, it leads to the problems of trolling that many of us will be intimately familiar with online. It leads to this problem of people with really what are completely socially unacceptable views, views based generally upon hatred, who act to basically suck all the air out of the room through their abuse of others online, under the aegis, under the banner of free speech. This is really not free speech that is useful to anybody. It's, on the other hand, clearly there's going to be a problem about the heavy hand of any kind of business who's trying to figure this out, or certainly of the government is going to be an even heavier hand. And the ideal of Buddhist free speech is one that really has to come from within in the final analysis. It has to come from who we are, rather than from an outside kind of authority figure deciding for us what counts and what doesn't count. However, I think we all know that society being the way it is, there's going to have to be a role for authorities of various kinds, because online communities that are not coordinated and administered properly simply fall apart in short order because of, again, the role of trolling online. Now, I also really do want to say that there are some exceptions to this. There are some problematic exceptions to all of what I've been saying today. And this is such a big topic that I'm going to do another video on that. So stay tuned and we'll see it soon. If it's already out, I'll try to remember to put a link to it up here on the screen. So pay attention to that. This question came from a comment by Anne over on Patreon, and if you're interested in supporting the channel, check out my Patreon page. Thanks to Anne for the question, and I hope we'll catch all of you on the next one of these videos. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.